I'm Tom Clark, and you're listening to Verse by Verse. Discernment is a skill we can all develop, but many people, I think, don't understand how vitally important that skill is. Our verse for today addresses that. It's found in Ezekiel 44, verse 23. In describing the various priestly duties, God said this, "And they shall teach my people the difference between the holy and the unholy, and cause them to discern between the unclean and the clean." The priests were not only tasked with teaching truth as opposed to error, but they were to help the people learn to discern the difference for themselves. There's an old adage about teaching a man to fish rather than just giving him a fish. And I think that principle applies here. The priests were to teach the people how to discern, not just do all the discerning for them. And what a wonderful thing it would have been if Israel and Judah had ever learned to do that. They came out of Egypt and moved into a land where the inhabitants practiced all forms of pagan religions and rituals. The people of the land prayed to trees. They practiced ritual prostitution. They believed in gods that only had power in certain areas. They even practiced infant sacrifice as a way of worshiping a deity that in reality didn't even exist. I'm sure there were plenty of teachers who stood up to provide very convincing arguments in favor of walking away from the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and moving on to more enticing beliefs and practices. And we know what the result of it was. Israel and Judah eventually were exiled from the Promised Land. If they had just learned to discern between the unclean and the clean, between what's right and what's wrong, what a different history they would have written. The need to discern between right and wrong has certainly not diminished with the passing centuries. And in fact, if anything, I would say the need is at least as great today as it was then, if not greater. We don't live in nations where most people are living in obedience to God. In fact, a growing percentage of the population, especially in Western nations, don't claim to belong to any religion. Even in areas where people tend to be more religious, nearly all of them practice some form of a mixture of truth and error. They take some things from the Bible, but they liberally mix them with pagan beliefs that sometimes go back for many centuries. This is what we regularly contend with as God's people, striving to maintain purity in our worship. We face the pressure to compromise on God's Sabbath, pressure to abuse alcohol and drugs, pressure to cross the lines of morality and ethics. So my question for you is, how well developed is your individual sense of discerning between good and evil? Author Nancy DeMoss Wolgemuth wrote, "Discernment is the ability to judge or distinguish between two things using the wisdom of God's Word." I think that ties in pretty well with what the Apostle Paul wrote when he said, "Be careful then how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of the time because the days are evil." Now, that's Ephesians 5, verses 15 and 16, and I read it from the New Revised Standard Version. If we want to be discerning, we need to keep our noses in God's Word so we can absorb His wisdom. Remember, Satan is a master at making himself and everything he represents look good and clean and pure and above all desirable. That's what he did with the Israelites. He made the things he knew were evil look good, and the Israelites were not discerning enough to see the trap that was laid for them. We need to be aware of the various influences of life that pressure us to compromise and wander from the truth, as ancient Israel did. Interestingly, one of the hallmarks of some cultures today is the concept of tolerance. And in balance, tolerance can be a very positive trait. But men rarely do things with balance, especially under the influence of Satan. So tolerance has come to mean acceptance of every lifestyle, no matter how sinful or how far from God. Again, our need to have discernment cannot be overstated. It's perhaps greater than it ever has been in all of human history. Discernment is a skill and it needs to be mastered. It requires that we watch the trends and direction of society, all the while making sure that we never lose sight of the truth God gives us in the Bible. We need to be a people who are able to discern between good and evil, between what is clean and what is unclean.
Verse by Verse is a Life, Hope, and Truth podcast. Check out the show notes to find more free content, like videos, articles, and booklets in our Learning Center.